Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, we go all the way around the globe to Australia to chat with James Parker. Jon is with us. Dr. Ann, our new co-host, is also with us today. And James, let's bring them all into the show today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement. Great to have you all with us. Jon, I'm going to let you take this away today.
Brad, thank you as always, and thank you to Dr. Ann Gillies for co-hosting this program. I could not do it without the two of you, and we have a very special guest, and what sets the stage for this particular program is our concern here at Unmasking the Trans Movement, our concern for those who are wounded, emotionally wounded, a significant number of those young people being sucked into this cult are sexually abused. Also, we can find them on the autism spectrum. These are very wounded kids. Oftentimes, they fit the criteria for severely emotionally disturbed. They are not being given adequate mental health treatment, and so they are ripe for manipulation and exploitation. That is our concern. We on this program are not anti any group of people. We are protective of women and children and those that are vulnerable. And in that light, it is important to us to feature those that have been manipulated so that they can speak out and encourage others in their journey to healing. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Ann Gillies, who has a special working relationship with James Parker, who's going to be our guest from Australia. So Ann, thank you so much for linking us with James. So tell us about James, and then we're going to hear his story.
Thank you, Jon, and welcome, James. Yes, it's wonderful that we can do this. I'm just always amazed at how technology works. So, James, I think I actually met you online maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was probably through something that you had actually produced, and it immediately caught my eye, and so I noticed, and then of course we belong to a couple groups together, provider groups, but also, just groups that we can bounce ideas off of, and it's very, very helpful. So I wanted to talk about a couple things today, James. The first one, I was hoping that you would give us a little background of your history, if you're open to that, and then a little bit about survivor support, the platform you have, and this is the third thing. So I'll try and come back to this and remind you. You've been doing some writing recently. I've read a couple of your articles that were just so well done. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about 2023 World Pride, those kind of things. So that's kind of setting the stage for the next few minutes, or half an hour or an hour. And we just welcome you kind of to take it from there. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking. I want to listen to you and what you have to tell us. So are you willing? And do you want to just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what fuels your fire?
Absolutely. Look, first of all, thank you so much for having me on here today. And I just want to explain to people who are listening who expected an Aussie accent to come out of this mouth. I'm born in Britain, raised in Britain, but for the past decade, Australia's very, very much been my home. And I'm what we call a true blue Aussie now, fully engaged in this wonderful and very, very vast country, which they also call a continent. That's how big it is. Some of my own story. Well, really, it clearly begins at the beginning, like everybody's does, but mine was a little bit different because I was born 2 months premature with my twin sister, and literally because my mother knew that she wouldn't be able to afford to keep the baby she was having, because she didn't know she was having twins at the time. She realized she was going to put this baby up for adoption. So 2 months premature, before the baby was due, she gave birth to twins. And we were both incubated, then we were fostered, then we were in an orphanage before being adopted. So the first 6 or 7 months of my life really was a lot of variation and very little stability, and nil stability really around father and mother. And that's particularly significant, if you don't mind me saying. Then we were adopted into a really wonderful family, an incredible family, with a couple who already had 3 of their own children, aged 5, 3, and 2. So there were 5 children, 5 and under. I think my parents are saints, and just whether you believe in God or not, they're just saints. But life seemed to kind of go perfectly well. But then at the age of 3, it's my earliest childhood memory. On one occasion, because my mother is trying to dress 5 children at this point, aged 8, 6, 5, and 3, and get them out the door to send them to school. On one morning, she couldn't find some underwear for a little boy, so she just grabbed some of my sister's underwear and put them onto me, and then put short pants onto me and sent us off to school. It was that first year at school, what we call kindergarten or kindy here in Australia. The challenge is this, is that halfway through the day, I was playing with the boys and my sister with the girls, which is not unusual when it comes to learning to demystify your own sex. And during that lunchtime period, my twin sister said, "Look," and I heard her voice say, "Look." So of course I turned to think, what's she talking about? And she was right behind me and she pulled my short pants down. And she said, "My brother's wearing my knickers." Everybody laughed at me. The girls laughed, the boys laughed. And I recall it being my earliest memory because I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. And many would say, well, you got over it. But something happened that day. And we know that trauma can be, it's profound. It has a profound effect on our lives. Then I was sent to an all-girls school for a year, just at the age of 4 and 5, which might have seemed very harmless. There were 2 or 3 other boys in the school. But rather than starting on that trajectory towards all things that little boys should go towards, I started on the trajectory towards little girls. And so, if you like, ballet and bunny rabbits became my kind of security rather than kind of football and a bit of a bruising, if we can use the B's again. The following year, I was sent to an all-boys school. And there I got given all the lead roles, female roles in drama. So you can begin to see what's happening a little bit. I don't have a really deep, secure base with parents, with mum and dad. I'm then being sent to I've been then, in a sense, been laughed at by the boys and girls. I then identified with the girls. I've then gone to a boys' school and I'm being given female roles. A year later, at the age of 8, I begin to be sexually abused by one of the teachers at school because I'm vulnerable. Exactly. Then what happens is then a family friend who's subconsciously, possibly, or even consciously aware I've been sexualized also begins to sexually abuse me. So between the ages of 8 and 11, I'm basically being sexually abused, and typically I'm being groomed into that. Yes. I'm manifesting all sorts of different behaviors, of course, particularly at home. But most people are saying to my parents, it's because of the adoption, it's because his life began difficult in the early stages, and therefore just keep loving him and being gracious to him. And my parents were wonderful, don't get me wrong, but they weren't aware of the telltale signs of sexual abuse during that time when I was a child. By the age of 14, I came out as gay. Clearly, I had been layered and layered and layered in homosexual activity before puberty. And therefore, my arousal antennae, if you like, were very, very much towards men. And of course, I'm still very, very feminine. And I'd learned that, really deep affection with other men meant to be sexual. And in the case of the family friend, really, I think really he wanted to ideally have access to a woman sexually, but had access to me. So in a sense was almost layering me or transposing onto me the fact that he wishes that I'd been a woman. So at 14, I came out as gay because there was no such thing as trans. And then by the age of 17, I'm wearing makeup. And I really am beginning to believe that I'm a woman stuck in a man's body. That set me up to be raped on 3 different occasions during my mid-late teens. And then at the age of 18, I went to London and I threw myself into gay activism. And was still wearing the makeup. My voice was significantly higher. My walk was very, very feminine. And if I'd had the opportunity to go near to a gender clinic, I would have been first in the queue. And I literally, thank God, that was not an opportunity for me. I ended up in a long-term gay relationship, eventually, after very much promiscuity. And it was in the midst of that relationship that somebody asked me a very important question one day, a very simple question. And he said, James, do you want more love in your life? I said, yes, of course I do. The long and short of that bit of the story is I was introduced to the person of Jesus Christ. Not only was I introduced, but then I introduced my long-term lover to Jesus Christ. And we both were deeply, deeply touched by the Holy Spirit of God. And what happened is, as Jesus makes very clear in the Gospels, he said, I will send you the Holy Spirit who will teach you everything. Now, I wasn't a particularly overtly religious man whatsoever. I was just somebody carrying around a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and I was trying to find love in the midst of all of that and connectivity. And all I can say is this is what happened on my journey is that was the incredible turning point for me, because I then began to see quite quickly that my boyfriend was trying to find something in me to resolve issues that he had. And I was trying to find something in him to resolve the issues that I had. And neither of us had it, which then began to help me to understand that even though we were monogamous and we were committed to each other, all the other coupled gay relationships around London at the time had become open relationships. And to some extent, my fear was ours was going to head in a similar direction. Now, not all relationships are like that, but for the most part, many are. And I began, therefore, to see, as the veils fell from my eyes, I began to see there was something deeply troubling and deeply wrong. And friends of mine at the time said to me, look, you know, you should probably go and have some therapy. And they found me a really beautiful, fatherly, insightful therapist who I went to see. And again, it's a very long story that I'll make short for viewers today, is we began a journey where I had totally and utterly repressed the sexual abuse, because by now my life was totally and utterly sexualized, totally sexualized. I saw everything through a sexualized lens. And slowly but surely, this man was able to bring me to a place where he said, well, I'll be honest with you, the first time he said to me, he said, James, do you think you were sexually abused? And I said, me? No. He said, you seem very confident to say no. I said, well, I'd remember, wouldn't I, if I'd been sexually abused? And he looked at me and said, possibly not. And I thought, what an unusual answer. And we left it. 2 weeks later, he said to me at the end, he said, I have some homework for you to do. And I said, what's that? He said, I want you to go away and I want you in your quiet time, when you still yourself and reflect and meditate or pray, whatever. He said, I want you to be open to the possibility of there being memories there relating to childhood sexual abuse. He said, don't push it, don't go digging. They will naturally come if they are there. He said, but I said, you've got nothing to fear, because if there's nothing there, nothing will come up. But if they are there, we need to know. And literally over the next 2 weeks, every day, it was like a little bit more, and a little bit more. And I began to remember, because I had somebody who could deal with this, because I was in a place where somebody was listening and able to help me and support me through whatever was going to be shown. What happened is both lots of abuse from the teacher and of the family friend came up for me. That was in my late 20s. I want to swing forward then another 11, no, it wasn't 11 years, I'd say 7 more years, when I actually went and knocked on the door of my actual abuser. And I went to forgive him. And I want you to hear this very carefully as well. I didn't forgive him to forget. I went to forgive him so I could be free inside. But I was saying to him, for you to receive my forgiveness is dependent on your willingness to face what you did. And I'm here to help you to face what you did. Because I also knew there were many, many other boys that had been sexually abused as well. And I was very correct in that. I was basically seeking to offer him a way out for himself to be able to face what he'd done, and also recognize the other survivors that existed would need some help themselves to get well, and their lives would be a mess. Regrettably, he didn't want to do that, and I waited several years for him to do that, when it came to the point that I went to the police, and what happened is we ended up with a guilty conviction. And even then, with the guilty conviction, I'm being very honest with you here today, I wrote to the judge and said, I don't want this man to go to jail. I don't want him to be put with lots of other convicted, what we might call pedophiles. I don't particularly like that term, with these people who struggle with or have an issue with minor attracted people. I don't like putting labels on anybody. I said, I want this man to get the help that he needs, not to be put with others and to actually feel worse about himself. What was particularly interesting, when I went back to see this man, I'd last seen him as an 11-year-old, and I went back as an adult. And when he opened the door, he was shorter than me. I was bigger than him. And what happened is, I was the one that had grown up. I was the one that was still in my youthfulness, and he was an old man. And suddenly the tables had turned. But it wasn't just that, but while I was with him, I began to realize that deep, deep within him was an incredibly broken little boy. And that he too, really, in his actions towards me, I believe that he was trying to find resolution of his own issues that our society itself was not taking seriously. And to some extent today still doesn't really take that seriously. So that's much of my story that led me on then to run a support group across London for people struggling in the area of sexuality and struggling with from effects of sexual abuse, struggling with gender dysphoria. And it became a very welcoming place for everybody. And even though a spiritual support group, very much with a Christian aspect to it, I had atheists coming along. At one point, I had a Satanist come along. He was admitted to being a Satanist. He said, when your ridiculous prayer stuff comes in, tell me, and I'll go and sort out the refreshments. So I even had a satanic refreshments coordinator, which was quite something. But nevertheless, my point is people need spaces and places and knowledge about what's happened to them. They need to be able to have insight. And it was having moved to Australia 10 years ago that I realized that very, very little is still offered here in Australia, even though we have profound abuse going on here. And that's not just the fact that our nation was built on abuse, very much on the prison officers terrorizing criminals who in many cases should never have been put on a ship, ripped away from their families and sent to a land where there was barely any infrastructure. But the other side of it, and this is a real passion for me, is for our First Nations, for our Indigenous people, where there is profound amounts of abuse. And I'm very pleased to say, on one level, that many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters find their way to our survivor support network. But I'm just very sad that they have to come to a network like this in the first place. Such is the degree of abuse that exists there within their people. So that's some of the length. It's a very lengthy way of taking a look at some of my own story. Incidentally, is after the therapy, what happened for me is very surprisingly, to me at least, is that as I went through the therapy and I began to find reconciliation around the trauma of the past, I could say it's as though, but I'm not going to say that. What happened is I believe that my true persona began to rise. And I was more surprised than everybody else to then, first of all, my voice began to drop. My walk began to change. And I learned to take my place as a man alongside other men. And nobody was pushing this, and nobody even warned me about this. But then I began to find women very attractive, having been 100% same-sex attracted. And that's because I'd found resolution, I believe, around all the trauma, not just the abuse, but I went back and found my birth parents, and I faced all the issues of my past. And therefore, I wasn't held in fear or shame or guilt or terror or any of these things anymore. What happened, I was able to live out of a place of love. And therefore, in a sense, I became what I believe was the true design of the man I should have been in the beginning. I'm still a work in progress, of course I am. But I never expected to be where I am today and doing the things that I often do today. for which I'm very grateful to all those who've helped me on that journey. And as a Christian, I'm also thankful to Christ, my Savior, for walking alongside me in that as well. So that gives you some of my own story there, Anne. That's question one down, at least. What was question number two?
Well, let me just interject here and ask you a couple questions.
Please do.
Thank you for being so vulnerable, James. I didn't know your story, and I am so impacted. We have a lot of similarities in the first 3.5 years of our lives. It's very interesting. But bless you. So as you're talking, and of course, Jon, you'll see this too with trauma, incident after incident that set you up, literally set you up. And one of the things that we see with activists is that they deny the reality of sexual abuse, and the extent of sexual abuse, particularly with gay men. And to me, that is very, it's so damaging, because it continues to suppress and repress all of the emotion. But so you had all of that, you articulated it so well, and I'm so sorry that you went through all of that. I mean, it just breaks my heart. It really breaks my heart.
Well, I mean, if I can interject to you, you know, it no longer breaks my heart, and this is the message that I come on with today, and I do a lot of mentoring work as well with some of in Australia's in its toughest rehab here, and generally the men who come in to see me, I mean, the trauma in their lives. Yes. I know that you talked previously, Jon, on issues relating to satanic abuse and many of these different issues. And these men, whether they've been sticking needles in their arms for decades in some case or other, when we get back to the original trauma, and when they move beyond that, and they learn to begin to associate again within their own bodies from the place of dissociation, it is phenomenal how quickly they grow. And all I can say is this: is if my years of trauma that have been, for the most part, dealt with, have given me the insight I've got today, then I'm very grateful for that. If only to be able to honestly and utterly walk alongside others who are traumatized, where for the most part, our societies are not concerned with them, and our governments do not take these issues seriously. So although I'm sorry to have been through what I've been through, I want to also say to any survivors watching this today, there is absolute and utter hope. I never thought I'd be where I am today. Never.
It's amazing. And I agree. Well, yes. My heart breaks for you as a child. I am so thrilled for where God has led you. Jon, you want to jump in here for a minute?
Yeah, sorry, I had my little mic muted. And I was just going to say, James, thank you. And the clock is our great nemesis here. Would you be able to stay right there? We will continue on the next episode, if you will. You have highlighted so many issues that are crucial, especially in relationship to, well, two things. One is with this massive push to affirm. Now, when we hear the word affirm, we all want to be affirming of somebody.
Of course.
But when it has to do with the trans movement, this term affirm simply means we as therapists or professionals or anybody is supposed to take a young person, take a emotionally wounded young person, yes, and simply take them at face value when oftentimes they are speaking out of their pain and they are trying to find answers, but oftentimes it's in denial. And to think that we are taking wounded young people and pushing them off onto a conveyor belt that will lead them to sterilization and amputation, lifelong scars, emotionally and physically, when what they need, James, is exactly what you said, which is the opportunity and a safe space to explore the deeper issues. So that is so profound. I'm hoping that policymakers, lawmakers begin to take this seriously, that the answer is not to fast track a kid by ignoring their pain off to medicalization. The other piece you referenced is very powerful, to think in terms of those perpetrators who have had access to kids, who really, in the vast majority of these kids, like in your case, have had sexual boundaries crossed, and so now they are gender confused. They need healing from that trauma, and the men that have done this, the vast majority of whom are actually beyond reach. But as you say, you had the opportunity to try to extend grace and reconciliation. It is so important for people to understand that many, many of these men have reached the point that they have, especially the sophisticated ones, where people have grown to trust them. There's no emotional reactivity. There's no, they don't stand out in a abnormal way. A lot of those men, unfortunately, have become deviant by choice, and so they're preying upon these young kids. They embed themselves in different movements, in churches. So you've highlighted very, very important issues. Would you stay right there? We're going to pick this conversation up in the part 2. Brad, thank you, and we will be back with James Parker and Dr. Ann Gillies.
Thank you very much, everybody. James, we're looking forward to part 2. There's obviously a mental health aspect of what's going on here, too, and I'm interested to find out how James feels about the mental health aspect of things as well, because it's not just about the sexual side of things or the things that have gone on. The mental side of things is what James has obviously overcome and done a great job of overcoming to this point, and I commend you on that, James. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm Brad Wilder, your host. Stay with us. Part 2 is on the way.